1. The night Ohio lost its silence. There are crimes that vanish as quickly as they appear, brief flashes of violence that dissolve into memory, swallowed by time. And then there are crimes that stay, crimes that linger, crimes that stain the landscape so deeply they survive long after the killer, long after the witnesses, long after the world has forgotten the name of the victim. On a cold November morning in 1981, the quiet community of Springfield, Ohio, woke to one of those crimes. The day had started like any other. The sun had just begun its slow climb over the flat Ohio farmlands, casting long shadows across the frost-coated grass. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, coffee steaming in their hands, unaware that beneath the peaceful surface of their town, a nightmare had already taken root, a nightmare that would remain unsolved for more than 4 decades. It began with the discovery of a young woman's body, partially concealed along the edge of a rural road, where the fields gave way to a tangle of brush and bare November branches. She was found by a man driving to Workaquai, reserved type who would later tell police he almost didn't stop. Something about the shape caught his eye, something out of place in a landscape he knew intimately, and when he stepped closer, the world seemed to tilt beneath him. The body was that of asterisk, 21-year-old Debra Lee Miller, asterisk. Her family described her as the kind of young woman who carried warmth effortlessly, a person who could calm a room simply by entering it. She was soft-spoken but confident, independent but deeply rooted in her relationships. She had dreams, simple ones, maybe, but genuine. Stability, love, a future she could build slowly and with intention. All of that ended before sunrise on that cold morning. For investigators, the scene was a mosaic of contradictions. There were signs of struggle but no indication of where it had taken place. There were traces of violence but no clear path the killer had taken. Debra's clothing was disturbed but not in a way that led to immediate conclusions. And above all, there was the unmistakable sense that the killer had intended for her to be found. Not hidden, not buried, just left. Almost as if the killer believed the discovery would speak for itself. But the scene offered no clear motive, no obvious suspect, no witnesses, no vehicle tracks, no reason for Debra to be there. And in 1981, long before forensic tools became what they are today, investigators were left with a list of questions that only grew longer as the hours ticked by. The initial investigation unfolded with urgency. Officers canvassed the area, knocking on doors, interviewing friends, co-workers, neighbors. They retraced Debra's final steps, reconstructing the last hours of her life, her routines, her habits, her relationships, her fears. And yet, with every answer came to new questions. With every lead came a dead end. People in Springfield whispered about dangers they had never considered before. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Men eyed strangers with suspicion. Every late-night sound, every unfamiliar car, every shadow became a reminder that something dark had entered their town. And through it all, Debra's family clung to the hope that justice would come swiftly. It didn't. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The case that had once consumed Springfield faded from headlines. Life moved forward, as life always does, leaving the Miller family standing in the wreckage of a tragedy no one could explain. The detectives assigned to the case carried the weight of it quietly. They reviewed files, followed rumors, re-interviewed witnesses, sent evidence to labs that could only do so much with what they had. They compared notes with other departments in the region, looking for patterns, for similarities, for anything that might illuminate the darkness surrounding Debra's death. But the 1980s were a decade ruled by limitations. No DNA, no genealogical tools, no advanced profiling, no digital trails. Investigations were shaped by chance, by eyewitness accounts, by the hope that the killer would slip or boast or confess. Debra's killer did none of those things. And slowly, inevitably, the case grew cold. In the Miller household, there was no such luxury. Her mother kept her room untouched for years, curtains still drawn, clothes still folded, the faint trace of her perfume lingering in the fabric. Her father avoided that hallway entirely. unable to bear the weight of walking past a door that would never open again. Holidays became rituals of grief, her absence a presence louder than any celebration could ever be. Yet even in their sorrow, the family remained steadfast. They attended every meeting, answered every call from police, provided every piece of information they could remember, no matter how small. They kept Debra's memory alive in conversations, in photographs, in the small moments of everyday life where she should have been standing. And behind the scenes, in a file room filled with dust and aging case folders, her story waited. Time did what it always does. It moved forward. Birthdays passed. Detectives retired. Technology evolved. The world changed. And the case that had once been viewed as unsolvable remained quietly preserved in the shadows of a police department that refused to forget. What no one knew then, what no one could have predicted, was that the evidence collected in evidence once deemed too limited to point to a killer, still carried the truth within it. A truth frozen in cells, silent but intact, waiting for science to catch up. And more than 40 years later, it finally did. But that moment when the past collided with the present is still far ahead. For now, in 1981, Springfield stood at the beginning of a long, painful journey, unaware that the path to justice would stretch across generations, unaware that the answers were already there, hidden, dormant, waiting for the day they would be seen. The night Ohio lost its silence was only the beginning. Dois, the shadows of Springfield, a community in fear in the days that followed the discovery of Debra Lee Miller's body. Springfield, Ohio entered a state of unease that settled into the air like an early winter frost. People spoke in hushed tones at grocery stores, at gas stations, in the parking lots of quiet churches and corner cafes. Springfield wasn't the kind of place where young women were found dead on the side of rural roads. It wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors in the middle of the day. And yet, overnight, that was exactly what it became. The local police knew immediately that the community was on the edge of fear. And fear, especially when fed by silence, can grow into something uncontrollable. Officers were instructed to increase patrols, knock on doors, reassure residents that they were working day and night to find answers. But reassurance meant little when the details of Debra's death remained shrouded in uncertainty. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed the killer was someone local, someone who blended easily into daily life. Others imagined a drifter, a stranger passing through, a ghost-like figure who drifted across state lines, leaving tragedy behind him. And in every version of the rumor, the same terrible question echoed. If he killed once, would he kill again? The Miller family lived through these days with a kind of grief that was impossible for outsiders to comprehend. They were not just mourning, they were navigating a surreal nightmare where every question led to another wound. Who would hurt her? Why? Where did it happen? Did she suffer? Could it have been prevented? Did she know the person who took her life? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, was the killer still nearby? Debra's mother refused to leave the house for days. She sat in the living room, holding a photograph of her daughter, Debra smiling beneath summer sunlight, eyes full of hope, unaware of the darkness that would one day steal her life. Her father spent hours pacing the hallway, saying little, his grief hiding behind a stoic calm that broke only when he believed no one was looking. Her siblings reacted in different ways. Some grew angry, others grew quiet. All of them felt the suffocating sense of injustice that accompanies a sudden, inexplicable death. And the police, despite working tirelessly, could offer them nothing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk behind the scenes. Detectives were struggling with a case that had no shape. The crime scene was too clean, the evidence too minimal, and the lack of witnesses or activity in the area where Debra was found gave them nothing to hold on to. Crime scene technicians pored over the few items recovered. Officers re-examined the position of the body, the condition of her clothing, the timeline of when she was last seen alive. Yet none of it formed a narrative they could trust. They mapped her last known movements with military precision. The route she took home from work, the people she spoke to that evening, her phone records, the friends she planned to see that week. Nothing pointed toward danger. There were no known arguments, no recent relationship issues, no conflicts at work. Debra's life seemed painfully orderly until the moment it wasn't. And that was what made the case so terrifying. Crimes born from conflict are easier to solve. Crimes born from opportunity are not. This one felt like the latter. But detectives knew better than to rely on instinct alone. They expanded their search outward, interviewing dozens of individuals who knew Debra in passing the mailman, the cashier she chatted with, distant acquaintances, people from neighboring towns who might have crossed her path by chance. Each interview chipped away at what little hope remained. Every trail ended in dust. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The psychological toll on investigators was more severe than they admitted. Cold cases do not start cold. They begin with passion, urgency, a relentless drive to uncover the truth. But when days slip into weeks and the truth remains buried, that passion turns into frustration, and frustration into quiet resignation. Some detectives brought their worries home, lying awake at night, replaying crime scene details. Others tried to detach emotionally, focusing on procedure rather than the girl whose life had ended so abruptly. But no matter their coping mechanisms, Debra's case stayed with them. One officer later said, "It felt like we were chasing a ghost, not a person." And perhaps, in a sense, they were. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Months passed, and Springfield attempted to return to normal. Businesses reopened fully. School events resumed. People stopped talking about the killing in public, though the fear never completely left. Young women traveled in groups. Parents kept a closer eye on their children. Locks were checked twice instead of once. The Miller family watched the world move forward without them. Their home felt frozen in time, a place suspended between the life they once knew and the silence that now filled the halls. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Holidays were observed rather than enjoyed, and every passing year added a new layer of unanswered questions. Detectives promised they would keep working the case. They did. But the 1980s were unforgiving to unsolved crimes. Without new evidence, without witnesses, without forensic breakthroughs, the case joined a growing stack of files marked pending or inactive. For officers, it was a professional challenge. For the Miller family, it was a lifelong wound. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the key to Debra's case had been collected on day one. Microscopic traces left behind by the killer. Cells too small and too degraded to provide the answers investigators needed at the time. To the technology of 1981, it was meaningless. To the technology of the future, it would be everything. For now, though, Springfield lived in its shadows. A town scarred by a crime it could not explain. A family searching for answers the world seemed unwilling to give. And a killer who moved silently through the years, untouched by justice. But time has a way of reshaping everything we think we know. Secrets weaken. Science evolves. Truth finds cracks to seep through. And one day long, after the town stopped whispering, long after Debra's case faded from local memory, the past would rise again, carried not by rumors or confessions, but by DNA. 3. The last hours of Debra Lee Miller. To understand the weight of what happened to Debra Lee Miller, investigators would later try to reconstruct her final day every moment. Every step, every interaction, hoping that somewhere in the ordinary routine of a young woman's life, the shadow of her killer might be hiding. On November 16th, 1981, Debra woke early, just as she always did. She lived with discipline, with structure, a calm, steady rhythm that helped her feel grounded in a world that often felt uncertain. She was the type of person who remembered birthdays, kept her room tidy, and never showed up late. She valued small routines. Morning coffee, the same route to work, familiar faces at familiar places. Her family would later recall that she seemed tired that morning, but not troubled. Her smile, gentle and unforced, was the same one she carried every day. None of them could have imagined that this would be the last time they saw it. She left the house shortly after sunrise, stepping into the brisk Ohio morning. The air was sharp, the kind that stinks the skin before it warms. The sky was pale, streaked with the faint gold of early light. She walked to her car, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, breath visible in the air. Nothing about her departure that morning suggested danger. Nothing hinted that the quiet sameness of her routine was about to unravel. Her co-workers later described her as soft-spoken, sweet, and reliable. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself. She did her work with care, engaged in light conversation, and kept to her circle of close friends. That day, she laughed at a joke someone made during lunch. She talked about weekend plans. She seemed, by all accounts, perfectly herself. And that was what made everything so deeply unsettling. There was no sign, no warning, no break in routine, no suspicious figure hovering at the edges of her life. She finished her shift as usual. She said goodbye as usual. She drove home as usual. Her last known moments were painfully ordinary. Investigators believe Debra returned home briefly that evening. Some signs of the house supported that theory. Lights left on personal items undisturbed. The familiar arrangement of belongings untouched. But what happened between the time she left work and the time she was found the next morning became the black hole at the center of the investigation. Theories emerged quickly. One possibility was that she had been followed. Another, that she encountered someone she knew. A third, that she had crossed paths with someone whose intentions were masked by familiarity. The lack of evidence made each theory feel equally likely and equally impossible. Friends told investigators she had no enemies, no jealous ex-boyfriends, no conflicts at work. She wasn't involved in dangerous activities or relationships that raised red flags. She didn't party heavily. She didn't stay out late. She wasn't the kind of person who took risks with strangers. And yet, something or someone intersected with her path that night. Detectives tried to trace the missing hours. They reconstructed the timeline with painstaking care. When she left work, the route she usually took the time she normally arrived home. The people who may have seen her in passing, any cars following her, any unfamiliar figures nearby, but Springfield was quiet that night. Too quiet. A few neighbors recalled seeing headlights moving through the area, but none remembered the make or model of the car. Someone else described hearing Ray's voices faintly along the road, but couldn't say when. Another mentioned a figure walking alone near the tree line, but the description was vague. A man, medium height, dark jacket, nothing concrete, nothing actionable. Just fragments. And fragments don't solve murders. In cases like this, investigators often look for moments breaks in habit, sudden detours, unexpected encounters that disrupt a victim's last hours. But Debra's evening seemed smooth and uninterrupted until the point where the trail simply vanished. Her car was later found where she had left it. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that she was taken against her will. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and never returned. One detective later remarked, "It was like she walked into a fog and disappeared." But people don't disappear. Someone takes them. Theories grew darker. Had someone lured her out? Had she been approached by a stranger, pretending to need help? Had she trusted the wrong person, someone who seemed harmless until it was too late? Others believed the attack began somewhere else entirely, that the roadside location where she was found was merely a disposal site. They analyzed the area, measuring tire tracks, studying soil disturbance, noting the accessibility of the location. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't obvious either. It was the kind of place someone might choose if they wanted the body to be found, but not immediately. And that raised questions of its own. Was the killer sending a message or simply rushing? No one knew. What investigators did know was that Debra had fought. Subtle signs of resistance, of struggle, were documented, even though the scene offered little forensic clarity. She had not gone quietly. She had not surrendered. The final moments of her life had been marked by fear, violence, and the will to survive. But she had stood no chance. Her killer had been prepared strong, decisive, determined. Someone who acted quickly and left the scene with chilling precision. Someone who knew how to avoid leaving a trail. Someone who believed he would get away with it. And for more than 40 years, he did. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The night of Debra's murder became a haunting enigma in Springfield's history. A day that began in normalcy and ended in tragedy. A day that left behind a wound that no amount of time could close. Her final hours remained shrouded in questions. A puzzle missing most of its pieces. A story with no witnesses. But what no one realized then, what no one could have realized, was that those missing pieces weren't gone. They were microscopic, invisible, embedded in the evidence, like seeds waiting to grow. And one day, long after everyone had stopped searching for the truth would come searching for them, carried not by memory, nor confession, nor eyewitness, but by DNA. 4. The investigation that vanished into darkness in the weeks following. Debra Lee Miller's death. The Springfield Police Department poured its energy into the case, determined to bring clarity to a tragedy that had shaken the community. But as the first month passed, a quiet panic began to take hold not among citizens, but among investigators themselves. They were losing the case. Not because they weren't trying, not because they lacked skill, but because they were fighting an invisible enemy. Time. Evidence that might have spoken loudly in a modern forensic lab in the 2000s was almost silent in 1981. DNA existed, in theory, in academic papers, in the minds of forward-thinking scientists, but in the world of criminal justice, it was still decades away from being useful. Fingerprint technology was rudimentary. Behavioral profiling was still young. Databases were shallow. Digital records didn't exist. And many investigative tools that today are considered standard simply weren't part of the world yet. The detectives assigned to the case were experienced, but they weren't magicians. They were working in an era when solving a case like Debra's required what many investigators privately called the triad: a witness, a confession, or extraordinary luck. Debra's case had none of the three. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. To rebuild the investigation. Officers returned to the basics. They walked door to door, interviewing neighbors who lived near the road where Debra was found. They went back to her workplace, speaking to co-workers more than once, hoping inconsistent details might reveal something overlooked. They mapped her circle of friends, acquaintances, anyone she had interacted with in the days leading up to her death. Every name was written down, every timeline checked, every alibi documented. None raised alarms. Her life was stable, predictable, quiet. The problem was that crimes like this, crimes without connection, are the hardest to solve. A killer who doesn't know his victim leaves behind nothing but chaos. No motive, no history, no shared relationships, no breadcrumbs. Just an act of violence in the dark. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. When their interviews stalled, detectives turned their attention to physical evidence. But the crime scene was too exposed. Weather had already degraded much of what could have been collected. There was no murder weapon, no vehicle tracks with distinguishing features, no clear footprints, and the samples collected here, fibers, trace biological material, were simply beyond the power of existing technology to analyze meaningfully. One officer later admitted, "We collected everything we could, but we had no way of knowing if any of it would ever matter." It would, but not for more than 40 years. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The lack of progress began to weigh heavily on the case's lead detectives. They worked late, hunched over reports under fluorescent light, the quiet hum of the station filling the silence. They reread statements, pinned maps to corkboards, traced and retraced Debra's final movements, searching for patterns that stubbornly refused to appear. Some nights, officers would linger at the station long after their shifts ended, staring at the evidence spread across the table, trying to force it into meaning. But evidence does not bend to the needs of the desperate. The case files thickened, but the leads thinned. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mons turned into a slow, heavy year. Springfield adjusted, as communities reluctantly do. People grew used to caution. The whispers faded. The unease softened to something quieter, an unspoken acknowledgement that the world was no longer as safe as it had been. For the Miller family, the world had stopped completely. Grief had replaced routine. Silence had replaced laughter. Holidays had replaced celebration with remembrance. They pushed the police gently, but persistently, calling regularly, asking for updates. Every time the phone rang, they hoped for a breakthrough. Every time, they heard the same words. "We're still working on it." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Behind closed doors, investigators faced a grim reality. Without new evidence or a confession, the case would soon need to be reclassified, moved from active to dormant, from a daily priority to an occasional review. No one wanted to say it out loud, least of all to Debra's family. But the pressure of limited resources and the weight of unsolved crimes accumulating across the state left them little choice, and so, reluctantly, quietly, the case slipped into the realm of cold. Cold does not mean forgotten. Cold does not mean ignored. Cold means paused, waiting for something the present cannot yet give. But cold cases carry a unique pain. Detectives feel they have failed. Families feel abandoned. Communities feel unsettled. And Debra's case was all of those things. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the file was pulled from storage every few years, discussed by fresh eyes, who brought new theories, but had no new evidence to test them against. Officers retired, passing the burden of the case onto younger investigators who were children when Debra died. Some believed the killer was long gone. Others believed he still lived nearby, quietly blending into the rhythm of normal life. The truth remained silent. And the evidence, small vials, sealed envelopes, microscopic traces sat inside a lab drawer, preserved but voiceless. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By the early 2000s, DNA was transforming forensic science. Cold cases once believed unsolvable began to crack open, but Debra's case remained in a peculiar limbo. The DNA collected at the time of her murder was too degraded to be useful by early methods, and too minimal to generate a profile that could be matched against the growing national database. There were discussions about retesting it, but technology still had limits. Labs could only take so many samples, and consuming evidence too early risked leaving nothing for future advancements. So the evidence waited. Not a day, not a year, but decades. Silent. Still. Preserved perfectly enough for a future no one in 1981 could have imagined. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The turning point to the moment when the past would finally begin to speak was still years away. But in hindsight, the most important part of Debra's case was not the initial investigation, or even the long period of stagnation. It was the fact that investigators preserved everything. They kept every fragment, every swab, every fiber, every scrap of biological material, not knowing whether any of it would matter, not knowing whether science would ever catch up, not knowing whether justice would ever come. But they saved it. And that decision made quietly in 1981, without fanfare, without expectation, would change everything. It would eventually identify a killer. It would give closure to a family. It would prove that no case is ever truly dead. But all of that belonged to a future still on the horizon. For now, the investigation had vanished into darkness, and the only thing left was the truth waiting patiently inside cells, in collections of molecules too small to see, too fragile to understand, waiting for the day the world would finally be ready to hear them. 5. A case suspended in time for most people. The passing of years feels gradual. Birthdays, holidays, familiar routines, quietly stacking on top of each other. But for the Miller family, time after 1981 did not move forward. It circled. It looped. It returned again and again to the same wound that refused to close. Every anniversary of Debra's death felt like reopening a door to a room no one wanted to enter, but no one could seal. Her absence shaped everything: empty chairs at dinners, photographs that stopped updating, moments that should have belonged to her, but now passed silently. Without her face, her voice, her laughter, the case file grew dusty, but their grief did not. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk in the Springfield Police Department. Debra's case lived in a metal filing cabinet's limb at first, then increasingly thick with reports, addendums, correspondence, and layers of hope and disappointment. It wasn't forgotten. No investigator ever said, "We'll never solve it." But there was an understanding, unspoken and heavy. They didn't know how asterisk could solve it. Still, the file was pulled out again in 1991. Again in 1996. Again in 2003. Each time, different eyes scanned the pages. Each time, new forensic techniques were considered, and each time, reality snapped the investigation back into silence. The evidence was insufficient. The case was stagnant. The trail was frozen. But the truth, the real truth, was not gone. It was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk in the mid-2000s. Forensic science grew rapidly. Labs gained the ability to extract usable DNA from samples that had previously been considered too degraded. Cold cases across America, cases older than Debra's cases, with even less evidence, began breaking open. But Debra's evidence remained fragile, carefully preserved, not yet ready for testing. Labs had to make difficult decisions. Should they try now, risking the destruction of the only biological material they had? Or should they wait for something better? The answer, incredibly, was patience. Preservation became the most radical decision they could make. They didn't know it yet, but the science of the future would need exactly what they had saved and nothing less. To test too early would have meant losing their only chance. The case, therefore, remained where it had been for decades, suspended in time, waiting. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, life marched forward around the edges of the tragedy. Detectives retired. New detectives were hired. The town changed. New businesses opened. Roads widened. Neighborhoods expanded. People moved away. New families arrived. And the memory of 1981 gradually faded into the background of Springfield's collective consciousness. But the Miller family remembered every detail, every second, every unanswered question. They kept the case alive through persistent calling the department, attending community meetings, checking in whenever forensic science made a major leap. Their hope was not naive. It was the only thing that made sense after so much loss. And slowly, very slowly, the climate around cold cases began to shift. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Then came a new era, one that no one in 1981 could have predicted. The rise of asterisk, asterisk, forensic genealogy, asterisk, asterisk. It began gaining national attention around 2016, when a handful of cold cases in the United States were solved using a technique still new and controversial. Instead of searching for exact DNA matches in law enforcement databases, genealogists searched for asterisk partial asterisk matches among millions of DNA profiles uploaded voluntarily to public genealogy websites. These partial matches pointed to distant relatives' cousins, Greek second cousins, once removed down from there. Specialists could build entire family trees, thinning the branches, narrowing the focus, and ultimately identifying a suspect. It was revolutionary, audacious, terrifying. 2 criminals, hope, 2 families. But in Ohio, Debra's case had not yet benefited from this new technology. The evidence sat sealed, temperature controlled, protected, touched for more than 35 years. Then one day, a conversation changed everything. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In early 2020, a young investigator, someone who was not alive when Debra was killed, asked a simple but powerful question. Do we have any biological evidence left from the Miller case? The question was not new. Dozens of officers had asked it before. But this time was different, not because the question was unique, but because asterisk forensic genealogy had matured into a reliable, proven method of solving cases, once believed to be impossible. Asterisk. Dozens of cold cases had already fallen. Killers long hidden behind time and anonymity had been identified, some alive, some dead, all finally unmasked. And with each new breakthrough, Pressure built on departments across the country. If we still have DNA, we still have a chance. The investigator combed through the evidence archive. Inside an old cardboard box, protected by layers of plastic and glass, they found what they were looking for. Microscopic traces collected from Debra's body in 1981, samples that the original investigators had meticulously preserved despite not knowing if they would ever be useful. These samples, fragile, decades old, were suddenly priceless. Asterisk, 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 before anything could be done. However, the evidence had to be examined. A lab needed to determine whether the DNA was intact enough to extract. Many cases failed at this step. Time decays, everything cells, proteins, genetic material. 40 years is a long time, but miracles sometimes hide inside the smallest things. Under a microscope, technicians found that asterisk, the DNA was still there. Asterisk, damaged, partial, but present, and modern techniques could amplify even tiny fragments into usable profiles. The room fell quiet. This was it, the moment the case had been waiting for. The moment the past reached forward to touch the present. Asterisk. In 2021, the DNA was finally sent to a specialized lab capable of performing forensic genealogy analysis. But the process would not be fast. It wasn't as simple as running it through a computer. It required months of work building family trees, checking birth and death records, examining census data, digging into archives, tracking migrations, marriages, name changes, adoption records. Some trees had dozens of branches. Some had hundreds. Some led nowhere. Some split into dead ends. But genealogy is the work of persistence. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. A cluster of DNA matches pointed to a particular family line. Not the killer himself, but people related to the killer. People who shared a percentage of DNA with the unknown man who murdered Debra Lee Miller in 1981. Names were added, connections traced, branches cut away, branches strengthened, until eventually the family tree narrowed to a single possibility. A man who had lived near Springfield in 1981. A man with a criminal history. A man who matched every detail investigators had been chasing for 40 years. A man no one had suspected. A man whose name was about to shake the entire case. But identifying him was only the beginning. To expose the truth, investigators would need more than genealogy. They would need confirmation. They would need proof. They would need the final piece of a puzzle that had spanned generations. And that piece was coming. Sace, the man hidden in plain sight. By the time the genealogical research narrowed the suspect pool to a single family line, investigators felt a shift in the Iran internal awareness that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. For 40 years, the case had been defined by fog, by uncertainty, by the weight of the unknown. But now, like a faint silhouette emerging through darkness, the profile of a Manan actual person began taking shape. The genealogists traced branches, documented children, mapped marriages and deaths, followed lines across counties and decades, until nearly every name on the sprawling family tree had been accounted for. All except one. One branch lingered unconnected, unresolved. One son, whose records existed only in fragments. One man whose life intersected uncomfortably with Springfield in 1981. His name was Daniel Lee Black, a name that meant nothing to the new generation of investigators, a name that had barely appeared in the original file mentioned once, then dismissed, because nothing at the time connected him to the crime, a name no one had spoken in decades. He had lived in Ohio during the early 1980s. He had a minor criminal record of violent, nothing that screamed predator. He had worked odd jobs, moved in and out of town, drifted through life without making much noise. He had been invisible. Exactly the kind of man who slips through the cracks of major investigations. Detectives pulled everything they could find on him. Employment records, residency, logs, court documents, old addresses, interviewed transcripts from the original case brief. Shallow and offering nothing. They searched for photographs. Only two surfaced: an old driver's license photo and a grainy group picture from a construction site. In both, Daniel had an expression that revealed little eyes neither kind nor hostile, posture neither relaxed nor tense. He looked ordinary, but ordinary men commit unspeakable acts every day, and genealogy had singled him out. Asterisk, 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 as investigators built a timeline of Daniel's movements. A disturbing picture formed. He had lived less than 2 miles from where Debra's body was found. He had worked a job with irregular hours, often late into the night. He had been single, unattached, with no fixed social circle. He had a history of trespassing minor charges, but always involving being in places he shouldn't have been. He had quietly left the area a short time after Debra's death. Nothing was definitive, but everything was suspicious. A detective studying the timeline whispered, almost to himself, "He fits." But genealogy alone wasn't enough. The science could point to a family, sometimes even to a specific branch, but the law required certainty. They needed Daniel's DNA. Not a relative's, not a cousin's, not a family line. His. And there was a complication no one could avoid. Daniel Lee Black had died in 2007. He was long buried. His life ended without ever facing consequences. But death doesn't erase DNA. Death doesn't erase truth. For investigators, a new question emerged. Where was Daniel buried? And could they legally obtain his DNA? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The legal process was slow, tangled in paperwork and procedures. To exhume a body, law enforcement needed authorized issue a judge's order. They needed to demonstrate probable cause, prove that disturbing a grave was justified by the pursuit of justice. Some judges hesitate. Some deny outright. Some demand exhaustive documentation. But in this case, the evidence, the overlapping timelines, the proximity to the crime scene was compelling enough that a judge granted the order. The decision was historic. Cold case exhumations are rare, reserved for only the most stubborn mysteries. And Debra's case had been stubborn for 40 years. Asterisk, 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 on a quiet, gray morning, under a sky heavy with low clouds, investigators, forensic specialists, and cemetery staff gathered around Daniel's gravesite. The air was cold, the kind of cold that numbs the fingers and stiffens the jaw. Only a handful of birds broke the silence. The process was respectful, methodical. The earth was removed layer by layer. The casket surfaced after decades underground. Inside, forensic specialists worked with care. DNA can survive long after death, but conditions vary. Moisture, heat, soil acidity, all can destroy genetic material. If the body was too degraded, if the bone had deteriorated beyond use, if the remains had nothing left to give, the case might remain unsolved forever. Everyone present knew this. The specialists retrieved what they needed: bone, teeth, fragments shielded from decades of decay. Then they closed the site, restored the grave, and transported the remains to a forensic lab. Now all they could do was wait. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Weeks passed. The lab worked slowly, methodically. Bones were cleaned, samples extracted, cells teased apart, DNA amplified. Sequencing began. Then came the comparison, the critical step that would determine the future of the case. Did Daniel Lee Black's DNA match the DNA collected from Debra's body in 1981? The process was grueling, requiring multiple tests, cross-tests, confirmations. Contamination had to be ruled out. Degradation patterns had to be accounted for. Every fragment of the genetic material had to be aligned with the original evidence. And then, the results arrived. The match was conclusive. A perfect alignment, a probability so high it defied coincidence. After 4 decades, the man responsible for the murder of Debra Lee Miller had been identified. A man who had lived near her, walked the same streets, shopped in the same stores, shared the same quiet town. A man no one suspected. a man who died long before justice found him. The weight of the discovery was enormous. Investigators felt a mixture of triumph, relief, and an ache that bordered on sorrow. For the Miller family, the news would bring answers but also reopened wounds long scarred over. Justice had arrived, but late. Precise, but incomplete. True, but bittersweet. And yet, even with the killer identified, the story was far from finished, because the final question still lingered, heavier than ever. Why did he do it? To answer that, investigators had to reconstruct a life that left almost no trace. They had the name. They had the DNA. They had the truth. Now, they needed the motive. A motive buried as deeply as the man himself. 7. The unmaking of a man. Reconstructing a killer when investigators finally confirmed the DNA match. One overwhelming question rose like smoke from the ashes of the past. Who was Daniel Lee Black? Not the name. Not the genealogy. Not the bones unearthed from a quiet cemetery after decades underground, but the mum. What kind of life produces someone capable of such brutality? What hidden factors, psychological, emotional, environmental shape a killer who looks ordinary on the surface? What moments in his life foreshadowed the violence that would erupt on a cold night in 1981? To understand what happened to Debra Lee Miller, detectives needed to walk backward into Daniel's past, tracing the contours of a life defined not by one crime, but by an escalating pattern of secrecy, frustration, and suppressed rage. What they discovered was a portrait of a man who lived his entire life in shadow scene, but never truly known. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Daniel Lee Black was born in the late 1950s in rural Ohio. His childhood, as described by surviving relatives, was unremarkable, quiet, and hard. Words that often hide deeper truths. His father worked long hours. His mother battled chronic illness. Money was scarce. The household atmosphere, according to one distant cousin, was tense, dominated by a father whose temper was unpredictable. Daniel learned early that silence was safer than honesty, that invisibility was a shield, that emotions were dangerous things best kept locked away. Neighbors later recalled that he was a solitary child, not cruel, not rebellious, just withdrawn. A boy who watched more than he spoke. A boy who drifted rather than connected. A boy who sometimes stared too long, not at people, but asterisk through asterisk them. These are not crimes, but they are cracks. Cracks that widen with age. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In high school, Daniel didn't stand out. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't bullied either. He floated just, present enough to be recognized, just distant enough to be forgettable. Teachers described him as polite but detached, bright when he tried, and uncomfortable in social situations. He avoided clubs. He avoided sports. He avoided anything that required teamwork or emotional vulnerability. Most classmates remembered him only vaguely when investigators contacted them decades later. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He never caused trouble. He was just there. But one former classmate said something that stuck with investigators. He looked like he was always holding something back. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By adulthood, those early cracks had deepened. Daniel worked a series of short-term jobs: construction, warehouses, seasonal laborally, staying anywhere long. Supervisors described him as someone who followed rules but lacked motivation. A man content to remain on the periphery of life. He'd never married. He'd never had children. He never built lasting friendships. People came and went from his life, and he seemed content to let them. Investigators studying his employment history noted a pattern every time he faced stress, conflict, or failure. He simply disappeared, quit, moved, started over somewhere else. He lived like a ghost, drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to leave a mark. Except once. In Springfield, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Daniel lived in Springfield for roughly 2 years surrounding 1981 to period, during which Debra was murdered. He rented a small room behind a mechanic shop, a place most people didn't even know was occupied. Records suggest he worked nights, mostly alone, performing tasks that required little interaction. A neighbor who lived near the shop did remember one detail. He kept odd hours, always coming and going at strange times. Another recalled seeing him walking alone along the edge of the tree line, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped, expression vacant. Nothing about him screamed danger, but danger rarely announces itself loudly. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Digging deeper, investigators found something else. Arrest records involving trespassing. Not violent crimes, not assaults, just being somewhere he shouldn't be. A locked shed behind a home, a barn on private property, a storage unit near an apartment complex. He never stole anything. He never broke anything. He never confronted anyone. He simply entered, looked around, and left. It was strange. Harmless on the surface, but unsettling beneath it. A forensic psychologist consulted during the cold case breakthrough remarked, "Trespassing for no reason often aligns with voyeuristic tendencies or a need to observe others without being observed. A desire for control, a fascination with private spaces, a thrill rooted not in theft, but in invasion. The early echo of a predator." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Investigators now believed that Daniel likely saw Debra before the night of her death. It may have happened at a store, on the road, near her workplace, by chance. A fleeting moment that took root in a mind predisposed to fixation. Predators don't always stalk consciously. Sometimes the obsession begins with something as simple as a glance. A man who spent his life invisible, noticing a woman who was warm, steady, alive. A man who had nothing, becoming obsessed with someone who had everything he lacked. It wasn't love. It wasn't desire. It was possession. Investigators suspect he watched her routine. Her commute, her habits, her patterns. Not for weeks. Maybe not even for days. Sometimes all it takes is one night. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. To reconstruct the moments leading up to the murder, detectives turned to behavioral science. The profiles from 1981 lacked the precision of modern methods, but combining the old reports with new psychological analysis painted a chillingly coherent picture. Daniel was impulsive, emotionally stunted, socially isolated, angry but quietly, inwardly, chronically. He likely approached Debra suddenly, relying on surprise rather than strategy. He may have tried to speak to her. He may have attempted a conversation she didn't want. Her rejection, real or imagined, could have triggered an eruption of violence. Some killers plan, some rehearse. Some escalate through years of smaller offenses. But others, like Daniel, carry years of suppressed emotion that burst in a single catastrophic moment. A moment where control slips. A moment where opportunity aligns with impulse. A moment where a quiet man becomes dangerous. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The tragedy of Debra's case lies not only in her death, but in the realization that her killer was not a calculating mastermind or a lifelong predator. He was something far more frightening. A man who lived unnoticed. A man whose rage simmered beneath still water. A man who walked among the innocent, invisible, and unremarkable. A man whose violence emerged from a lifetime of small fractures, cracks no one saw until they broke wide open. Understanding Daniel did not excuse him, but it did reveal something critical. Evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a man no one remembers. A man who leaves no legacy. A man who fades quietly into the world until the day he doesn't. And even now, even with his name known, his DNA identified, his story laid bare when question refuses to be silenced. What exactly happened between Daniel Lee Black and Debra on that night in 1981? To answer that, investigators needed to reconstruct the crime itself. A reconstruction 40 years in the making. Oito. Tracing the night of the crime, a reconstruction of darkness to understand the truth behind Debra Lee Miller's final moments. Investigators had to reconstruct the night of November 16, 1981, with painstaking precision. Not with photographs, not with witnesses, but with fragment slivers of evidence, patterns of behavior, environmental clues, and the psychological profile of a man whose life left almost no footprint behind. Reconstruction is part science, part intuition, part empathy. Detectives must inhabit the victim's last hours, walking the same paths, breathing the same cold night air, imagining what she saw, what she feared, what she didn't know. And in Debra's case, they also had to step into the fractured mind of the man who took her life. Asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk. That evening, the sky darkened early. November nights in Ohio carry a stillness that feels almost unnatural, as if the world is holding its breath. The fields around Springfield settled into a deep quiet after sunset, broken only by distant traffic or the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Debra left work, as she always did. There was nothing unusual in her behavior, nothing that suggested she felt watched or followed. She drove along familiar roads, likely thinking about ordinary things: dinner, work tomorrow, maybe calling a friend. But while her night seemed routine, Daniel's night was anything but. Based on everything investigators learned about him, his patterns, his impulses, his history of quiet trespassing, they believe he had already seen her earlier that day, maybe for the first time, maybe not, but it was enough. Something about her captured his attention. A confident woman, focused, structured, warm. Everything his life had never been. Predators often choose victims who represent something symbolic. In Daniel's case, investigators believe Debra triggered a deep psychological dissonance: admiration, contaminated by resentment, a longing warped into fixation, a desire that metastasized into violence. They do not believe he followed her for long, maybe hours, maybe minutes. But that night, he waited. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Reconstructing the route she took home revealed several possible locations where Daniel could have intercepted her. A narrow stretch of road with no streetlights. A bend in the trees where cars slow naturally. A turnoff that leads toward the fields. Investigators walked these paths over and over, studying sightlines, estimating how long a car could be followed without detection. One detail stood out: the location where Debra's body was ultimately found. It was not random. It was hidden enough to avoid immediate discovery, yet accessible enough for someone who knew the area. And Daniel knew the area intimately. He had walked those back roads late at night. He had trespassed on properties nearby. He had spent years existing on the periphery of Springfield's quiet rural landscape. This was his territory. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Investigators believe the attack began near the road. No signs of a drawn-out struggle were found at her home, ruling out the possibility that she was attacked indoors. The most plausible scenario is that she pulled over voluntarily or under pressure. Perhaps she thought Daniel needed help. Perhaps he blocked her path. Perhaps he flagged her down. Crucially, there was no sign of robbery. Nothing was stolen. This was not opportunistic criminal behavior. This was personal, emotional, explosive. Profiles of similar crimes indicate that the initial interaction may have started with conversation, not long, brief, tense. The kind of encounter that turns from awkward to dangerous in seconds. A rejected comment, a refusal, a misinterpreted look. Something triggered Daniel's break. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The violence was sudden. Investigators concluded from the nature of Debra's injuries that the attack escalated quickly, rage-fueled, frantic, uncontrolled. The kind of violence that erupts not from careful planning, but from years of emotional suppression snapping all at once. One forensic analyst described it bluntly. This wasn't calculated. This was a man coming apart. Debra fought. She resisted. Her instincts, her will to survive, left marks atol but present on both her body and the environment. But Daniel was physically stronger, fueled by adrenaline and obsession. Within moments, the situation spiraled beyond control. And then came the second phase, one that reveals the chilling clarity predators sometimes reach asterisk after asterisk. The violence has already begun. Daniel regained composure. He dragged her to the roadside area. He concealed her body. He fled. Not fast, not panicked, but methodically. Signatures of a man who did not want to be caught, but lacked the intelligence or resources to truly cover his tracks. He was not a mastermind. He was a coward in crisis. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The aftermath is often where killers make their most revealing mistakes. But Daniel's life, after the murder, remained disturbingly flat. He didn't brag. He didn't confide in anyone. He didn't suddenly disappear. Instead, he drifted just as he always had. And a few months later, he quietly left Springfield, not because he feared arrest, but because he feared proximity to the scene, to the memory, to a version of himself he could not face. Killing Debra did not give him control. It shattered what little stability he had. It consumed him internally, even as he pretended nothing had changed externally. One investigator studying his later years remarked, "It wasn't guilt, it was panic. He killed to control." But afterward, he realized he couldn't even control himself. Daniel spent the rest of his life drifting, never holding a steady job, never forming meaningful relationships, never staying anywhere long enough to grow roots. He lived like a man haunted, because he was asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. What makes the reconstruction chilling is that there were no witnesses, no dramatic chase, no risky escape. The crime was committed in silence, under cover of darkness, by a man whose life had always existed in the margins. There was no master plan, no long-term strategy, just an eruption of violence that lasted minutes, and consequences that lasted 43 years. Investigators, when presenting this reconstruction to the Miller family decades later, emphasized one heartbreaking truth. There was nothing Debra could have done, nothing she did wrong, nothing she could have predicted. She crossed paths with a man who had been unraveling his entire life, a man who needed no motive, no reason, no provocation, only opportunity. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And yet, the reconstruction, though meticulous, could not answer everything. Why, asterisk, that asterisk, night? Why, asterisk, her, asterisk? Why did Daniel carry this crime in silence until his death? To answer these final questions, investigators needed to piece together the last remnants of Daniel's life, the places he drifted, the people he encountered, the things he left behind. They had understanding. They had DNA. They had identification. Now they needed the final piece, the meaning behind the madness. And that journey would lead them to the final revelations of a case that defied time itself. 9. The final unraveling. A killer's life in shadow with Daniel Lee Black, officially identified through DNA. Investigators faced the final challenge of the case, understanding the life he lived after the murder. Not because it would change the outcome, he was dead, long buried, but because the Miller family deserved answers, and closure requires understanding. What investigators found was both illuminating and haunting. A life that dissolved slowly, quietly, almost intentionally, as if Daniel himself were trying to disappear from the world long before he was physically gone. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After leaving Springfield in 1982, Daniel spent the next several years moving from place to place across Ohio and neighboring states. Nothing about his movement was dramatic. He didn't flee to big cities. He didn't reinvent himself under a false identity. He simply drifted. Small towns, short-term rentals, cash jobs, motor lodges, seasonal work, odd jobs paid under the table. He lived the kind of life investigators described as designed to leave no trace, no mortgages, no long-term employment, no meaningful relationships, no address that lasted more than a year. The more they studied his pattern, the clearer it became. Daniel wasn't hiding from police. He was hiding from himself. One behavioral analyst summarized it with chilling simplicity. He lived like a man running from a memory. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. What surprised investigators most was how invisible Daniel remained. Most violent offenders eventually escalated, committing more crimes, taking bigger risks, drawing attention. But Daniel's life, after the murder, seemed to contract rather than expand. He didn't develop a criminal record that matched the brutality of what he'd done. He didn't attack anyone else. He didn't commit any violent offenses that police were aware of. Instead, his life deteriorated inward. He isolated himself. He withdrew from society. He lived on the margins emotionally, socially, financially. Some killers plunged deeper into darkness. Daniel dissolved into obscurity. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't remorse. It was collapse. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In 1989, he spent a few months living in a rundown boarding house in Dayton. Housemates later remembered him as quiet, strange, and gone most nights. One person claimed he often paced the hallways alone after midnight, whispering to himself. Another recalled that he kept his room meticulously clean except for a chair placed in the center facing nothing, positioned like a solitary island in an empty sea. A psychologist reviewing these details remarked, "Chairs like that often represent a place of internal confrontation, a mental battlefield." Daniel's battlefield had no enemies except the ones inside his head. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the early 1990s, he worked at a scrapyard. The owner remembered him. Vaguely soft-spoken, reliable but distant. He never joined co-workers for lunch. He avoided conversations. He never joked, never complained, never shared anything personal. He looked tired all the time, the owner later said. Not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a weight he couldn't put down. This description struck investigators deeply. Daniel didn't act like a man who had gotten away with murder. He acted like a man unable to escape it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. As the years passed, Daniel's mental health appeared to deteriorate. Though no formal diagnosis existed in any medical record, people who encountered him described paranoia, insomnia, disheveled appearance, sudden bursts of anger, quickly followed by withdrawal, periods of social disappearance, sometimes lasting weeks, odd behaviors with no clear explanation. A former neighbor from the mid-1990s recalled seeing him standing at the edge of a wooded area behind their apartment complex, staring into the trees for long stretches of time as if waiting for someone, or hiding from someone. Another neighbor mentioned hearing him talking to himself through thin apartment walls, too faint to make out, but filled with tension. These weren't arguments, the neighbor said. They were confessions. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By 2000, Daniel was essentially living off temporary labor, surviving paycheck to paycheck. His criminal record remained minor, mostly trespassing and loitering citations, the same patterns from his youth continuing into adulthood. It was both baffling and chilling. He had committed one of the most brutal crimes in the region's history, and then faded into the background so thoroughly that law enforcement never connected him to anything significant again. Some killers escalate, some evolve, some refined their methods. Daniel fractured. His life became a slow-motion disintegration. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In 2004, he was admitted to a hospital for a minor medical issue. The nurse on duty described him as agitated, distrustful, and afraid of being touched. When asked for emergency contacts, he said, "I don't have anyone." When asked about family, he shook his head. Whether he was lying or telling the truth didn't matter. His isolation had become complete. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By 2007, Daniel was living in a small, dilapidated duplex in rural Ohio. He rarely left. Neighbors saw him maybe once a week walk into a corner store, shuffling slowly, shoulders hunched, eyes down. He avoided eye contact, avoided conversations, avoided life. And then, at age 49, he died alone, unnoticed, without ceremony, from natural causes linked to years of untreated health problems. He was buried quietly, attended by almost no one, remembered by almost no one. A killer who lived and died invisibly. A ghost who left behind a single act of violence that devastated a family and haunted a town. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. When investigators learned the details of Daniel's later years, there were no celebrations, no sense of triumph, only a somber understanding. Debra had lived a life of kindness, stability, warmth, and purpose. Daniel lived a life of drifting, detachment, paranoia, and disintegration. One detective said it best: Debra was everything he wasn't. That's why he destroyed her, and that's why he destroyed himself afterward. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk for the Miller family. These revelations were painful but necessary. They did not soften the loss. They did not excuse the crime, but they provided something elusive. A portrait of the man who stole Debra's future, a sense of the darkness she encountered that night, a fragile understanding of why the violence happened, and most importantly, a realization that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived with full force. But the story was not complete yet. There remained one final chapter, one final truth, one final reckoning with the impact this case left on everyone involved, and the closing of a circle that had been open for more than 4 decades. This closure in the shadow of time, the legacy of a 43-year pursuit. When investigators gathered to present the final findings to the Miller family, the room felt heavier than usual. Not with dread those decades had already passed, but with gravity, with the weight of a story that spanned generations, with the solemnity of a truth that had taken 43 years to come into focus. Families of cold case victims learned to live in 2 timelines: the life before the tragedy and the long stretch of unanswered years that follow. For the Millers, Debra's murder was not a chapter, it was an era, an unending season of grief, silence, and questions that eroded the heart. But on the day of the announcement, when law enforcement finally spoke the name, asterisk, asterisk, Daniel Lee Black, asterisk, asterisk, everything shifted. The air changed. The room exhaled. The past settled. One family member said quietly, "We've waited our whole lives to hear this name." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The presentation was thorough and gentle every step of the genealogical process. Every reconstruction, every psychological insight, every test and retest that confirmed the DNA. The evidence was undeniable. The science was irrefutable. The answers were finally, undeniably, theirs. But closure is never simple. It doesn't arrive like a sunrise, warm, bright, cleansing. It arrives like dusk, complex, bittersweet, layered in shadows. On one hand, they finally knew who did this. On the other, justice had come too late for accountability. Too late for a trial. Too late for Daniel to face the consequences of what he had done. The killer was dead. The story, in a legal sense, was over. And yet, emotionally, spiritually, the closure was profound. The family could breathe in a way they hadn't in for decades. Debra's memory was no longer trapped in uncertainty. Her story was complete not because of the killer, but because of the relentless pursuit for truth, a pursuit that never stopped. A pursuit that spanned multiple generations of detectives. A pursuit that proved something essential about justice. It may be slow, but it is patient. It may be delayed, but it is determined. It may sleep, but it never dies. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. For investigators, the resolution of the Miller case was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph because they had accomplished something extraordinary, solving a cold case that had haunted files and hearts since 1981. Tragedy because they were closing a case that should never have taken this long to solve. One detective, now retired, attended the announcement, though he had worked the case early in his career. When he saw the final DNA match, his eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "I always believed we would get him. I just didn't think I'd live to see it." The room fell silent, because this was more than a case. It was a torch passed from one generation to the next, each refusing to let it fade. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The story of Debra Lee Miller now stands as a testament to the power of perseverance and the evolution of forensic science. When she died, DNA testing didn't exist. When the case went cold, the technology couldn't help her. When hope began to dim, forensic genealogy rewrote the rules entirely. Her case became one of the growing examples that show why cold cases must never be dismissed as unsolvable. The evidence might be microscopic. The samples might be old. The trail might be frozen. But science moves forward, and justice moves with it. In the 2020s, forensic genealogy has become one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigation. It bridges the present and the past, turning fragments of genetic code into roadmaps of truth. It gives voice to victims who can no longer speak. It gives families answers they were told they would never receive. And in Debra's case, it did something even more extraordinary. It resurrected the truth from a grave. It reached backward across for decades and pointed to a man no one suspected. It gave meaning to evidence collected by hands that believed in a future they would never see. The detectives of 1981 didn't know the science that would one day exist, but they preserved every scrap anyway. They acted on faith, and that faith was rewarded. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After the public announcement, the Miller family held a private gathering. They shared photographs, stories, memories frozen in time Debra's handwriting, her favorite songs, her soft laugh captured in old audio tapes. For the first time, these memories felt like pieces of a life rather than fragments of a tragedy. One of her siblings shared a message that echoed through the room. We finally know what happened, and now we can finally celebrate who she was. In that moment, the case shifted from a true crime story back into a human story, where it belonged. A story of a young woman whose life was stolen, but whose legacy now includes the power to bring justice even from beyond the grave. A story of a family who waited half a lifetime for answers. A story of a town changed, then healed by the truth. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. As for Daniel Lee Black, his name will never be remembered with sympathy or complexity. He chose the path of silence, of cowardice, of violence that shattered lives and left scars on generations. His anonymity shielded him for decades. His death protected him from earthly accountability. But accountability is not only legal, it is historical, it is eterno. It is written in the fact that he did not escape. Not really. His DNA told the truth he thought he'd buried. His story ended not with secrecy, but with exposure. His final legacy is not power, but condemnation. And that is that justice cold cases provide the justice of truth. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Miller case stands today as a symbol of hope for families still waiting, still searching, still grieving. It proves that no matter how much time passes, no matter how deeply buried the truth may be, answers are still possible. Forensic science is still evolving. Genealogy databases are expanding. Cold case units are growing nationwide. And the darkness that once protected predators continues to shrink. Debra's case is not just a solved murder. It is a message. Time is not the enemy. Silence is not the end. And even the coldest cases can burn bright again. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. As the documentary ends, viewers are left with the final, quiet truth. This story is not only about a killer, it is about a woman who deserved a full life, a family who never stopped fighting, and a justice system that despite its flaws did not give up. Debra Lee Miller's name now stands not in the shadows of an unsolved crime, but in the light of a case finally closed.